You put on a mask this morning, not a real one. A face for work, a face for family, a face for strangers on the street. You didn't think about it. You never do. But 11,000 years ago, in a marsh in what is now northern England, a group of people put on a mask that was real and heavy and made of bone. They wore the skulls of deer. This sounds like something out of a horror film. It isn't. It's archaeology, and the real story is stranger than anything you'd invent. In the 1950s, an archaeologist named Graham Clark was digging through the wet peat of a site called Star Carr, near the edge of an ancient lake in Yorkshire. The mud there is a strange kind of miracle. It's low in oxygen, so things that should have rotted away thousands of years ago simply didn't. Wood survived, antler survived, and so did something else. Skull caps of red deer, still attached to their antlers, with holes carefully drilled through the bone. Those holes weren't decoration, they were for straps. Someone, thousands of years before writing existed, before farming existed, before the pyramids were even a dream, sat down and turned a dead animal's head into something you could wear. Clark found a handful of them. Over the following decades, archaeologists found more. Today, there are at least 33 known headdresses from that single site. 33. That's not one eccentric hunter with a strange hobby. That's a pattern. That's a practice. Here's where it gets stranger. The skulls weren't just strapped on and worn like a hat. Researchers who later studied the frontlets, including archaeologist Nicky Milner, who led major excavations at Star Carr in the 2000s and 2010s, found that the antlers had been deliberately lightened. The makers had thinned and trimmed the bone, shaving away weight so the headdress could actually sit on a human skull for hours without breaking someone's neck. Think about that. This wasn't a costume thrown together in an afternoon. This was engineering. Prehistoric hunter-gatherers were doing structural bone modification to make sure their ritual gear was wearable. Why would anyone do this? The honest answer is that nobody alive today knows for certain. There's no diary, there's no myth passed down in an unbroken line to explain it. But the clues left behind point somewhere specific, and it's not costume party. Some of the headdresses show heavy wear, scratches, polish, the kind of damage that comes from being handled again and again over years, maybe passed from person to person, maybe stored and brought out for something recurring. That's not what a one-time disguise looks like. That's what a ritual object looks like, an object that returns. And this is where the deer stops being just an animal and starts being something closer to a disguise for the human mind. Anthropologists who study hunting societies across the world, from Siberia to the Kalahari, have long noted a pattern. People who rely on animals for survival often don't see a hard line between themselves and the creatures they hunt. Wearing the head of your prey isn't just theater. It's an attempt to think like the deer, to move like the deer, maybe even to become the deer, if only for a few hours, so you can predict where it will run before it does. There's a term researchers use for this kind of belief system: shamanism. A shaman, in the way anthropologists define it, is someone who claims to move between the world of humans and the world of spirits, animals, or the dead, usually while in an altered state of awareness. The deer skulls at Star Carr are one of the oldest physical hints of this kind of practice anywhere on Earth. Not a painting of it, not a myth about it. The actual gear. And here's a detail that tends to stop people cold. Some of the antlers were deliberately shaped so the animal appeared to still be alive, alert, head raised, as if listening. Whoever wore this wasn't hiding from the deer. They were performing as the deer, in front of other people, in a community that, by every estimate, was small, close-knit, and utterly dependent on hunting to survive the winter. Picture it. A cold morning by the edge of a lake in Mesolithic Britain, long before Britain was even fully separated from the European mainland by the sea, smoke curling from a fire. A person stepping forward wearing the skull and antlers of a red deer, moving in a way that isn't quite human anymore. What would that have felt like to the people watching? Not silly, not a joke, something closer to witnessing a boundary get crossed right there in front of them. Some researchers, including archaeologist Chantal Conneller, have proposed that these headdresses were tied to hunting magic, an attempt to gain power over the animal you depended on for meat, hide, bone, and tool material. Others suggest a role closer to spiritual leadership, a person who mediated between the human group and the unpredictable, dangerous, essential natural world around them. The truth might be both. Religion and survival were not separate categories back then. They were the same problem, approached from two directions at once. Now here's the part that should really sit with you. Star Carr isn't an isolated oddity. Deer and animal headdresses, disguises, and masks show up again and again across prehistoric and early historic cultures, from cave art in France showing figures with antlers, to later shamanic traditions across Siberia and North America involving animal skins and skulls worn during ritual. This wasn't a one-off invention by a small group of eccentrics in one soggy English valley. It was one local expression of something close to a universal human impulse, the need to step outside your own skin and borrow the power of something wild. You don't wear deer skulls today, but you still do a version of this, and it's worth sitting with. You put on a uniform and something in you shifts, becomes more confident, more capable, more of a role than a person. Athletes talk about getting into character before a game. Actors describe a costume changing how they move before it changes how they think. Psychologists have a name for this general effect, enclothed cognition, the idea that what you wear can measurably change how you perform and how you feel. The deer skull wasn't just symbolic. It may have been functional in exactly this way, thousands of years before anyone had a word for the phenomenon. There's one more detail that deserves its place among the craziest facts here. The Star Carr site also produced some of the oldest known evidence of built structures in Britain, along with worked wood, ornaments, and tools, suggesting this wasn't a fleeting camp of desperate wanderers. It was a place people returned to season after season, generation after generation, for perhaps hundreds of years. The deer skull rituals weren't a fluke performed once by a confused hunter. They were, as far as the evidence suggests, sustained tradition. A practice maintained, taught, and repeated across a span of time longer than the entire history of the country, whose soil eventually swallowed and preserved it. Sit with that for a second. The gap between you and Star Carr is longer than the gap between you and ancient Egypt built twice over. And still, the impulse behind that headdress, the need to borrow another creature's power, to mark yourself as something other than ordinary, to stand in front of your community changed, has never actually left the human species. It just stopped wearing bone. So the next time you put something on before a big moment, a suit before an interview, a jersey before a game, even just a different posture before you walk into a room you're nervous about, you're doing an ancient and strangely dignified thing. You are reaching, in your own small, modern way, for the same trick a hunter by a cold lake in Yorkshire discovered 11,000 years ago. You're putting on the mask you need to become the version of yourself the moment demands. Let's go back to the mud for a moment, because the mud is where the real strangeness lives. Star Carr sits at the edge of what was once a much larger lake, long since drained and turned into farmland. 11,000 years ago, that lake was the center of everything. Fish, waterfowl, reeds for building, and on its shifting, marshy edges, generation after generation of people threw things into the water, not by accident. Archaeologists now believe much of what survived at Star Carr wasn't lost. It was deposited on purpose, offered to the water itself, the way later cultures would throw swords and jewelry into lakes and rivers as gifts to something unseen. Think about what that means for the deer skulls. Some were found not in the dry ground where people lived, but out in the wet edge of the old lake bed. Objects that took real skill and real time to make, given not to a person, but to the water. That single detail turns the headdresses from strange archaeological curiosities into something closer to what you'd recognize instantly if you saw it in any religion practiced today. A sacrifice. An offering made to something the people who made it could never fully see or control. And the craziest part isn't even the skulls themselves, it's the timeline. Star Carr dates to roughly 9000 BCE, in the period archaeologists call the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age. At that point, agriculture hadn't been invented anywhere on Earth. Nobody was farming wheat. Nobody had built a permanent town. The wheel didn't exist. Writing wouldn't exist for another 5,000 years. And yet here in a damp corner of what would eventually become England, people were already engaged in something recognizable as organized religious ritual, complete with specialized costume, repeated practice, and symbolic offering to nature. It forces an uncomfortable question. Why do you assume ancient people, especially hunter-gatherers, were simple? Why does Stone Age so often sound like an insult in your head? A shorthand for primitive, for less than. The deer skulls say otherwise. They say that somewhere in that Yorkshire mud, a community had already worked out something that took modern researchers decades of careful excavation to even partially understand. That meaning matters as much as survival. That a hungry, cold, physically brutal existence still leaves room, and maybe even demands room, for symbol, performance, and belief. There's a detail from later excavation seasons that rarely makes it into popular retellings, and it might be the strangest of all. Alongside the deer headdresses, archaeologists uncovered evidence some researchers interpret as evidence of dance, or at least deliberately rhythmic, repeated movement tied to these rituals, based on wear patterns and the layout of the site itself. Picture it fully now. Firelight. A frozen lake catching the last color of a winter sunset, a figure moving with a dead animal's skull fixed to their skin, in front of people who depended on that same animal for every meal that would keep them alive through spring. This wasn't entertainment, it was survival dressed up as theater, or maybe theater dressed up as survival. The two might not have been separable at all. You live in a world engineered to remove exactly this kind of uncertainty. Food arrives in plastic. Predators don't wait outside your door. You rarely have to wonder, in any real physical sense, whether tomorrow's meal exists. That certainty is new. It's younger than you probably assume, and far younger than the deer skulls of Star Carr. For the overwhelming majority of the time humans have existed on this planet, uncertainty about survival was the baseline condition of life, and ritual, whatever else it did, gave people a way to act on that uncertainty instead of simply enduring it. That's maybe the real reframe hiding inside this story. Those headdresses weren't decoration for the sake of decoration. They were technology. Bone and antler, thinned and drilled by hand, engineered to be worn without injury, so that a person could stand in front of their community and do something no ordinary hunter could do. Become, for a few charged minutes, the animal itself.